During our last class session, we started with an overview of listening, and I defined the distinction between hearing versus listening. We talked about poor causes of listening. And what I didn't get into, and this is how I wanted to start this particular lecture, is give you sort of a breakdown of percentage of what we do during the day. So we spend between 60 and 80% of our time, waking hours, communicating. Of that, we usually spend about 45% of that time listening. We spend about 30% speaking and about 16% reading. And then the rest is made up of other things. And that, of course, is pre-COVID. And that is also probably before, those numbers probably reflect the world before the prevalence of social media. So I've embedded in here a little Easter egg. This is what I call an Easter egg. It's a chance for some extra credit, but you have to watch the lecture in order to get it. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look up any current statistics to find out what percentage of our time are we on social media, which would mean that we're reading and writing more and speaking less. If you can send me that data through Canvas, I'll give you some extra credit. Okay, moving on to the 6 types of listening that we do. These are not ineffective types of listening. This is simply the generalized types of listening that we can do at any point in time. The first is what is called discriminatory listening, and it's not what it sounds like. It has nothing to do with discrimination. It has everything to do with being able to identify a noise in part. So, you're home alone, you hear, a branch, break or something, and you immediately like get alarmed. Like, was that a noise? Was that someone at the door? That would be discriminatory listening. It's also what you do when you're in a crowded room and you hear your friend's voice or you hear them laughing. You can always hear your friend laughing. That would also be considered discriminatory listening. And finally, if you're in a class and an in-person class and you hear the instructor say something about extra credit, it's like, boom, you always hear that word, right? And you always hear, this will be on a quiz. Quiz and extra credit are the 2 words. If I ever want to get your attention, I just need to say one of those 2 words. All of those would be considered discriminatory listening. In other words, what did I just hear and how does it affect me? Would be discriminatory listening. The second kind of listening is what's called appreciative listening, and this is pretty much as it sounds. It's listening for enjoyment. And so if you have a favorite music that you like to play when you're driving, you don't put on music you hate when you're driving. You don't put on music that you dislike or are annoyed by when you're studying, right? It's all things that you enjoy listening to. That would be considered appreciative listening. When you were younger, if one of your parents or grandparents read to you at bedtime, that kind of just hearing that voice and hearing that story told over and over again would have also been appreciative listening. If you just enjoy hearing someone's speech pattern, if they're from, England, for example, or Scotland, my brother-in-law is from Scotland. I love to hear him talk, and sometimes I get so distracted by his speech pattern that I'm not listening to the content. I'm just sort of listening to him. Whoops. And I'm going to keep going because I'm pretending this is live, just pulling my microphone back up. So that's how excited I get about a Scottish accent. So that would be considered appreciative listening. The next kind of listening is comprehensive listening, and this is what we do when we're making sense of something. So generally when you're listening to a lecture and you're hearing major points and you're seeing things being put up on the board and you're trying to think, okay, did I understand what they said? Do I understand the word that they just used? That would all be comprehensive listening. So it's simply making sense of something. And listening to lectures would be the best example that I have. It's also called, just for information, I won't quiz you on this, it's also called content listening or informative listening or full listening, but I think comprehensive listening is the best word to illustrate what it truly is. The next type of listening is what's called critical listening, and this takes comprehensive listening one step further. So this is when you're listening to information to make an evaluation or a judgment or to form an opinion. So if a friend of yours is talking about which college they want to transfer to or what major they're looking at, and you're listening with the intent of thinking, okay, I need to give them some advice, I need to be able to give them some good feedback about majors or about colleges, that would be considered critical listening. So it doesn't mean critical meaning that you're angry or mean or saying unkind things. It just means that you're taking more cognitive effort. And so the idea of critical thinking, of course, in college means that you are able to take either side of a situation and kind of look at what's going on. That would be considered critical thinking. So critical listening means that you're doing the same thing. You're hearing information and it goes beyond comprehension, and now you're forming some kind of evaluation. This is also called, by the way, evaluative listening. I also won't quiz you on that, but there's the other term for it. It's nice to know that there's other terms for this kind of stuff. And it might be that your book is using one of these. The next type of listening is what's called empathetic listening. I think also empathic listening sometimes is the term that's used. And this goes, beyond sort of the critical thinking. This is when you really try to identify with what a person is saying. So it might be in conflict. You're really trying to understand a person's perspective. That goes beyond critical thinking. That's now, can I understand how you're feeling? Or if, you hurt somebody's feelings and they came to you and said, you hurt my feelings the other day when you said this or when you did that. And you're like, well, I don't understand how I hurt your feelings there. Could you explain that to me? That part of that listening is called empathetic. So it really deals specifically with feelings as opposed to content, which would be the comprehensive and the critical listening. And then finally, so there we've got the animation for the empathetic. Again, this is live. There's my second mistake. The empathetic listening where you've got the two faces and the information goes out of the one head, out of the maze, and then into the other person. So they sort of try to figure out what's going on there. And then the last type of listening is what's called dialogic listening, and that's the two little figures on the bottom where you've got the jumbly on one side and the heart on the other side. And this really deals with the communication of the relationship. It doesn't have as much to do with the content of what's being said, but it's really about sort of creating the bond that you have with somebody and listening so that you have that bond. So when a person tells you about a story from their childhood and you listen and you just don't go, and here's my story. When you listen and then that comes back in a later conversation, you can see how important that would be to somebody that you remembered that story that they told you. So the dialogic listening is very important because it helps us sort of understand each other a little bit more, and then we can bring back that information. So it goes beyond all the content and beyond the feeling and looks at how we listen to each other to form this bond and also to maintain this bond. So that's the end of the types of listening. You already have uploaded the second part of this lecture, which is ineffective listening behaviors, which would be 2B, 2 just designating that this will be for quiz number 2. So feel free to enjoy that one, and if you can watch that one before class on Monday, that would be fantastic. All right, I will see everybody later. Have a great weekend.